you know, we've been in a tense situation with Iran for, well, since the revolution. Jimmy Carter went over to Iran about 6 months before the revolution and congratulated the Shah on his wonderful leadership and made a statement that Iran is an island of stability in a sea of unrest. So 6 months later, the Shah was gone. And Jimmy Carter was talking to generals in the Pentagon to see if they could pull off a coup to restore the Shah. The students were rifling through the files at the American Embassy, compiling 15 volumes of secret correspondence showing that it was in fact a nest of spies. So Jimmy missed it. He missed the revolution. A lot of people did. But there's been hostility since then, and although it's not getting the headlines now that it should, there's been a series of things that happened recently that make it look like at least by shortly after the election we'll be back in an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation. I think they're trying to keep it off the radar until the election's over, because people, Democrats or Republicans, are not in the mood for another war. So, but anyway, this is not a long piece, but it says the price of gas is going through the roof. Want to know why? Because Washington, London, and Tel Aviv are all trying to bring down Iran. None other than the pro-war Richmond Times-Dispatch said so in its February 23rd edition. Quote, oil prices have soared this year as tensions grew between Iran and the West. The article in the paper's business section predicted that the cost of a gallon of gas could hit $4 or more this summer. No, it came close when down and now it's going back up again. The tension the article refers to isn't because of Iran, it's because of the war being waged right now against Iran by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Israel. There are no Iranian ships off the U.S. coast, but the Pentagon keeps a massive naval presence in the Persian Gulf, plus troops stationed in countries around Iran, like Iraq and Afghanistan. For its part, Israel is threatening to bomb Iran. Under pressure from the U.S., the UN Security Council has slapped 4 rounds of sanctions on Iran. The U.S. has had its own sanctions since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and has just imposed a new round designed to make it impossible for Iran to sell its oil on the world market. The European Union has imposed similar sanctions. These sanctions are meant to try and strangle Iran economically and bring it to its knees. They are themselves acts of war and also preparation for war, just like the 9 years of sanctions imposed on Iraq between the first and second U.S. wars against that country. Then there are the recent assassinations of 4 Iranian scientists, drive-by shootings in broad daylight in downtown Tehran, and the November 12th explosion at a big military base 30 miles outside Tehran that killed 17 people, including a high-ranking general, and sending a sophisticated drone spy plane in December over Iranian territory, a violation of international law. And according to investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, the guy who exposed both the Vietnam War's My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, U.S. Special Operation Forces have been on the ground in Iran, organizing anti-government attacks by counter-revolutionary groups like the Jandala, MKO, and PKK. See, we're already at war. We're told Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, even though there is absolutely no evidence that it is. Zero. None. Zilch. Don't believe the Defender? How about the New York Times? Right, it's not that bad. Quote, despite the position of the Israelis in AIPAC, this American Israel Political Affairs Committee, the largest lobbying group in Washington, the American intelligence agencies continue to say that there is no evidence that Iran has made a final decision to pursue a nuclear weapon. There is no evidence that Iran has made a final decision to pursue a nuclear weapon. So they haven't made a final decision, they're not working on it. Recent assessment by American spy agencies have reaffirmed intelligence findings in 2007 and 2010 that concluded that Iran had abandoned its nuclear weapons program. That's from March 4th, 2012. Of course, that article neglects to mention that there is no proof Iran ever had a nuclear weapons program, or that Iran hasn't attacked another country in more than 200 years, or that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has repeatedly said he believes it would be a sin for Iran to develop a nuclear bomb, and this is the man who controls the Iranian military. So what could possibly explain the intense U.S. hostility against Iran? Once again, it's about oil. Iran has the third largest oil reserves in the world, and that makes it a target for Western governments that take their orders from the giant corporations. We all got a big lesson in how this works when the George W. Bush administration lied to us about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. Nearly 4,500 GIs, 1,000 civilian contractors, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives because of that lie. Plus, Iran's oil is nationalized. It's owned by the government, not private corporations. So instead of making profits, the government uses the oil revenue to pay for a universal healthcare system, free education through college, subsidies for basic necessities, and other public services. And that means that one, the oil companies can't get their hands on Iran's oil, and two, the idea of a country standing up for itself against the empire sets a very bad example for the rest of the world, like Cuba or Venezuela. The Islamic Republic of Iran does have a program to develop nuclear power for peaceful energy purposes, something it has a right to do under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, which is signed back in the 1960s. It's that program that the US, UK, and Israel demand Iran dismantle. But even though Iran is the most inspected country in the world, the UN watchdog International Atomic Energy Agency has never once said it has found that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon. Never. Meanwhile, Israel is widely believed to have some 200 to 300 nuclear weapons. But Israel is one of only 3 countries that has never signed the NPT, so it never gets inspected. And Washington never objects to its nuclear weapons. The other two are Pakistan, and if that makes you feel comfortable, that's an interesting reaction. The other is India, which despite the fact it never signed the NPT treaty, is a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency and inspects Iran. Yes, yet we're told that it's in Iran, which has no nukes. That's the big problem. We've got a big decision to make. Are we going to let ourselves get dragged into another war for oil, or are we going to stand up and demand that our tax dollars instead be used to create jobs, fund quality public education, build a universal healthcare system of our own, and clean up our polluted environment? It's our call. So what I like about that article is it kind of puts it into a context of, a little bit of urgency. And the fact that, this war, it's not like we're trying to prevent a war. There is a war going on now. I won't read the whole thing, but I just happened to look at this. I put it aside. Richmond Times-Dispatch, thinking we might want to use it in the paper. It's from June 2nd. Cyber attack on Iran said to be the work of U.S. Israel. There was this thing called the Stuxnet virus that took out, stopped the functioning of the nuclear power plant in Iran. And it turns out Obama ordered it. They said they weren't sure that it was a virus, a deliberately concocted virus, and so on and so forth. But it says a damaging cyber attack on Iran's nuclear program was the work. It's the Washington Post. Reprinted. Was the work of U.S. and Israeli experts and proceeded under secret orders of President Barack Obama, who was eager to slow that nation's apparent progress toward building an atomic bomb without launching a traditional military attack, current and former U.S. officials say. That's cause for going to war. Not to mention the fact that the virus didn't stop at the borders of Iran and now it's showing up in U.S. corporation computers.
But also no one, I think, in the U.S. media has pointed out that the cyber warfare is also very illegal. It's been, right? I know, right? And then I think there are also other parallels with the run of the Iraq War as well, with the claims of Saddam Hussein being able to launch an attack within so many minutes. We're hearing that again in some of the recent press, which is also very false.
The one issue that Americans, U.S. North Americans, are most concerned about when it comes to foreign policy is nuclear war. before the first Gulf War, in '91, George H.W. Bush was having all these polls done because they wanted to attack Iraq, but there was no enthusiasm for it. Iraq went into Kuwait, and they said, we've got to liberate Kuwait, and people said, Kuwait? We've got to put the emir back on his throne. So they tried all these different ways, it's about, aggression, it's about jobs, it's about, they made up the story of the Iraqi soldiers coming into a hospital in Kuwait and throwing babies out of incubators. Yeah. It's taking the incubators back to Iraq because there was an incubator shortage. And it turns out, no lie, that the young woman who gave this story to the UN Security Council, saying she worked at a hospital, was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. And the whole thing had been concocted by a Madison Avenue PR firm. And that kind of got people, that got people roused up a little bit. It turned out to be false. But the thing that, when they finally, the polls, they found out that the one issue when they raised it, that Iraq might be trying to develop a nuclear weapon, that got a big response. So they made up the story about Iraq sending agents to Africa and coming back with yellow dust. And, they wound up, outing a CIA agent, Victoria Plume.
That's what the second war, but in the first war, the first Gulf War as well, Bush changed the reasons that he was trying to sell this war for. And so you're right, it was only after they invoked this myth of Saddam having or pursuing weapons of mass destruction that the public opinion changed.
Yeah.
Because they then perceived that their own security was at risk.
Right.
So that was how they sold the first Iraq War, as well as the second Iraq War, was the indication, this very dishonest indication of WMDs. You're absolutely right.
So, we've got this history. I mean, the whole history of the blowing up of Havana Harbor and the U.S. Winter War, the Spanish-American War, all the officers happened to be off the main when the explosion happened. It's odd. You really see that in the Navy. All the officers were off the ship. The Lusitania was carrying munitions when it was sunk by German U-boats, not the U.S. into World War I. So, we ought to be skeptical at this point. But with Iran, they combine this barrage of accusations with a demonization of the government so that, people who otherwise might have their heads on straight just say, well, that's a crazy government. I mean, they're capable of anything. I believe they do that, So let's just look briefly at some of the major charters. Is Iran trying to develop a nuclear weapon? I think that was kind of answered. There's no evidence whatsoever. Iran signed this treaty back in the 60s. Almost every country has signed it. What it says is that if you have nuclear weapons, you're supposed to reduce them and work towards their total abolition. And if you don't have nuclear weapons, and you promise not to try to develop them, you have the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful energy purposes. You have the right to develop it, and not only that, but the other countries that have signed the treaty are supposed to help you develop it. So under this international treaty that is the major non-proliferation treaty dealing with nuclear weapons, the United States is under the obligation to help Iran develop nuclear power plants. And yet, the U.S. says, yes, we recognize that right. However, we think you're using the development of nuclear power as a cover for developing nuclear weapons. And the worst offender in this is the Associated Press. It always refers to Iran's nuclear ambitions, Iran's nuclear program, Iran's attempt to develop nuclear power, as if it was the same thing, nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Now, personally, I'm opposed to nuclear power. There's no way to get rid of the fuel. The fuel's going to be around forever. And, if there's an earthquake, you're in a lot of trouble. And Iran is an earthquake-prone country. But France, which until under Sarkozy was the most aggressive European country demanding Iran stop developing nuclear power, depends on nuclear power for 80% of its energy. I think it's 16% of the world's energy is produced by nuclear the United States. I mean, what right do they have to tell Iran they can't have, but yet Iran, I was just reading a government book the other day that mentioned that Iran has been in trouble in the world because it has refused to convince the rest of the world that it's not developing nuclear weapons. It has refused to convince. Now, they say, come in and inspect. There's 20 sites that are open to the IAEA, anything that is remotely connected to nuclear weapons. But the UN agency says, no, we want to visit this military base. We think you're doing something there. So Iran has to figure, do we really want them to come in and nose around our military bases? Because that's what they did to Iraq. See? They sent CIA agents over with the UN inspection team. Scott Ritter was one of the inspectors, and he wrote a book about it. He quit in protest. They were just collecting information. Not only that, the IAEA writes up reports. In some of the reports, they mentioned interviewing Iranian nuclear scientists. And 2 of them have been assassinated since the report came out. So 4 of them have been killed altogether in Tehran, drive-by shootings or open shootings. That is, pretty widely believed to be the work of Mossad agents from Israel working in conjunction with U.S. intelligence. So Iran's in a position where it could give up its nuclear power program. It could just give it up. And so what? They've got a lot of oil. They could survive without nuclear power. Except that oil is finite, and someday they'll run out. And the population is twice today what it was 30 years ago. They already have, a certain number of blackouts in major cities because of not having enough electricity to provide everyone. But also, Iran doesn't have the refinery capacity to refine its oil. It has to sell its crude oil on the world market and buy back refined oil. Now, why doesn't it just build a refinery plant? Because there's a there's sanctions against it. They can't buy the parts. They can't buy the material. They tried to start a wind plant, a wind power plant. And a Danish company was going to sell them the information, and the U.S. told them to sell to Iran, they can't sell to the United States. So they couldn't do the project.
So this is a carrot and stick approach of Washington, correct?
To the other countries.
Right.
To the, with Iran is
so-called soft power of the U.S.
Yeah, right. Well, that's what the latest sanctions say.
Yeah.
If you deal with Iran, you can't deal with the United States. The U.S. is the biggest market in the world, and Iran is relatively small. So,
But then if Iran gives up its civilian nuclear program, which even American intelligence agencies say that they don't believe Iran is developing or has any intention of transforming that into some kind of weapons-grade nuclear program, what will be the impact on the medical isotopes that they won't be able to use?
Yeah.
Or just patients with.
We'll get into one little technical thing, sure, then we'll move, because that's important, and then we'll move on to some of the other issues. But nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons both use uranium. Uranium is a raw material in the ground that has to be refined, purified. So in order to do that, you set up these machines called centrifuges, and they spin. And they spin in a certain configuration, and it's a very tricky thing to get hundreds of them to spin just right, which is why most countries don't have nuclear power. Iran figured out how to do it. If you purify uranium to a 5% level of purity, that's what you use in a nuclear power plant. If you purify it to 95%, that's what you use in a nuclear weapon. And it's not a question of just cranking up the dial from 5 to 95. It's a different setup. Yeah, you need more centrifuges, they're configured differently, and it would be virtually impossible for Iran to set this up without the U.S. knowing about it. So Iran says, so how can we prove that we're not doing something that we're not doing? if Bentley says, "Phil, are you still beating Anna at night?" And I say, "No." And she says, "Prove it." And I say, "No,
Can't prove it
how do I do that?" And then you come to my house and you find a hammer and you go, "This is the dual-use thing here. You might use it, to put up a picture, but you could use it to hit Anna too." Right? I mean, there's no way to prove you're not doing something that you're not doing. So they just say, "You're doing it." Iran can develop uranium to 5% purity, and it's recently, in the last year, been able to reach 20%. Now that's important because under President Gerald Ford, a little three-person team went over to Iran to convince the Shah that he needed nuclear power. That team included Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and someone else who was also famous after that. And they told the Shah, oil is a finite resource, you're going to run out of it eventually, and we got companies like Westinghouse and General Electric that can help you build a power plant. So he signed a $3 million contract, or a set of $3 million contracts. And under the Atoms for Peace program, they built a nuclear reactor in Tehran University that is for medical purposes. It produces isotopes that are used in cancer treatments.
What the hell the American government?
Right. And there's 180,000 cancer patients in Iran who depend on the isotopes from this reactor, which is running out of fuel. And that was what all the arguments was about. Iran wanted to crank up and produce 20% enriched uranium. The U.S. said, no, you can't do that. And so there's all kinds of different plans, things that were proposed every time they went to the settlement. The U.S. said, no, that's not good enough. And so Iran was kind of stuck. They went ahead and they got up to 20%. That's a ways from 95. But the U.S. said, see, we get closer. So they're kind of stuck. They can give up really their right, their national sovereignty, give up their right to develop nuclear power and be humiliated before the West. But of course, but that's not the issue. The issue is that Iran has the third largest oil reserves, sells the second largest amount in the world, could control the Strait of Hormuz, which passes at least 20% of the world's oil. I keep reading these bourgeois newspapers, and one says 20 and one says 40, and you wonder how people keep their jobs if they can't figure out how much oil is going through the Strait of Hormuz. But it's a very narrow little strait, and the navigable part apparently is in Iranian territory. So the U.S. says, Iran is too dangerous. So Iran is caught between a rock and a hard place. Meanwhile, that's not the only charge being made against Iran. So let's move on to the crazy Ayatollahs, so-called, and their threats to destroy Israel because they supposedly hate Jewish people, and the president even denies the Holocaust. Iran has the second largest of Jewish people in its country than any other country in the Middle East except Israel. About 30,000 people. And they've lived there for 3,000 years. Since Cyrus, the head of the first Persian Empire, took over Babylon and liberated the Jews who were held as slaves, and brought them back to Jerusalem and raised money so they could rebuild the temple. But someone felt good enough about Cyrus, they decided to settle around Esfahan and now in Tehran. They're not Zionists. The Jews, they're not Zionists. They don't support Israel. And Israel tells them, if you emigrate, it's very embarrassing for Israel to have all these Iranian Jews who don't want to move to Israel. Say, they will give $5,000 to any Jewish family that moves to Israel. They'll give $10,000 to an Iranian family. And right-wing Christian evangelical groups will believe that the second coming can't come until all Jews return to Israel, at which point they'll all either die or become Christians. I'm not sure why the Israeli government thinks this is a good ally, but they will put up another $10,000. So an Iranian family can get $20,000 to move from a country targeted by U.S. imperialism to Israel, which has one of the highest standards of living for Israelis in the world.
To bring about the end of the world.
Yeah. So it's not a big goal for a lot of people. Now, but didn't President Ahmadinejad say you know, we will wipe Israel off the map. No, he didn't. His translator said that. Ahmadinejad gave a talk at a conference on Zionism in Tehran, I think it was 2005. And he said, as the Imam has said, referring to Ayatollah Khomeini, this regime occupying Jerusalem will disappear from, I think it was the pages of history. And the translator, who was a government translator, translated as Israel will be wiped off the map. And that went out, and although anybody who knows Farsi, and I've seen this in many different sources with every word laid out in its English translation, there is no word for wipe off the map in Farsi. Right?
The Middle East scholar Juan Cole has also affirmed this. He has said that there is no idiom for just that phrase.
Wait.
Well, I said it too.
You speak Farsi, yes?
Yes.
I don't wait for the government.
Would it be possible to have, you read Farsi, I assume as well. Would it be possible to actually pull up this text in Farsi and have you translate it?
Sure.
Okay, at some point later in the evening? Great.
Because it really hurt. And now you might say, because I did, okay, look, if it's a mistranslation, why doesn't Ahmadinejad just come out and say it? And it's taken me a little while to figure out why he and some other government officials don't seem to take the charge of anti-Semitism as seriously as we might think they do. And it's a little more understandable when you're in Iran, because the defense of Israel is usually tied to the Holocaust. Israel is a country that was created so Jews would never have to again experience the Holocaust. When you're in Iran, you're in a different part of the world, and you realize, you know, there were many Holocausts. First of all, there was the transatlantic slave trade, you know, which took 100 million lives, and probably depopulated Africa to the tune of another 100,000, 100 million. When it started, there was 100 million people in Africa, and 100 million people in Europe, and 200 years later, there were 200 million in Europe, and 100 million in Africa. I call it a Holocaust. But in our country, we talk to think of one Holocaust. And of course, it wasn't 6 million Jews. It was 6 million Jews and 4 or 5 million other people. Romans, the disabled, leftists, communists, trade unionists, lesbians and gays. And so you can see even like, you know, you wonder why someone who's supposed to be humanitarian would ignore the deaths of 4 or 5 million people in order to concentrate on one a group of 6 million, called that the Holocaust and ignore everything else, because it was a political reason for doing that. You know, I mean, I think it's a very serious issue. I'm pretty sure that